So, there always comes a time when we learn about our protagonist's powers, whether it's One for All for Deku, learning about chakra in Naruto. There's always some point, especially when they have a mysterious power or an unknown power that is unique to them, like with Asa's anti-magic. There's always a backstory to it. And today we are going to talk about the backstory for Kafka's kaiju powers and where the worm kaiju originated. And in chapter 117 for kaiju number 8, it gives us the first part of the worm kaiju's backstory. So, the chapter begins with Kafka appearing on a battlefield surrounded by warriors clad in samurai armor. And in this battle, they are facing off against a very big kaiju, and all they have are basic weapons like swords, spears, and arrows. Or at least that's what we thought. It turns out that these weapons are actually kaiju weapons made from parasitic kaiju flesh. And before technology was used to integrate with kaiju uni-organs, this is how they were able to combat against kaiju attacks in ancient times. And while fighting against this kaiju, Kafka sees who he thinks is Vice Captain Hoshina. But this is actually a very distant ancestor of Hoshina that took place in this battle, which is actually part of the history of the worm kaiju. And despite their disadvantage in this battle, they're able to defeat the Yoju, which is extremely big for the times, not as big as the super giant class kaiju that we see in modern day. And then it kind of freezes and we see the vestige of the samurai that Kafka has seen a few times while confronting the worm kaiju. And it goes on to say that this day was like any other. They were just slaying kaiju and carrying out the harsh duties that came with being the samurais of this time who were charged to protect the land of Japan. But then he hesitates and says, or so we thought. And then we see all of the soldiers begin to fly up in the air and we see Mei appear. And back then it was probably one of the biggest kaiju they had ever seen, but not as big as what we see inside of kaiju number 9. Mind you, this Mei is still relatively more tame, but still the strongest kaiju in history. And these samurai soldiers that were experts at hunting kaiju stood no chance against them. But as samurai do, they fought valiantly to the very end, and what ended up happening is going to be very surprising. And also during this carnage, we see that Hoshina's ancestor was actually captured, not really captured, was skewered and then eaten by Mei. So one of Hoshina's ancestors exists within kaiju number 9 or kaiju number 9 Mei, whatever you want to call it. But once the battle is over and everything has been destroyed, we see Kafka fall into the mindscape of the worm kaiju, which turns into a sort of abyssal sea. And then we see all the bodies of the slain samurai just creep up out the depths saying the shame, over and over again, and they start to swarm Kafka. And eventually all these samurai soldiers' souls begin to merge together, surrounding Kafka and engulfing him until they become the worm kaiju. And the chapter ends with what looks to be the newly birthed worm kaiju saying that we are nothing like insects, we are powerless. And that concludes the chapter. But now let's really talk about what this may be symbolizing. So because they use parasitic kaiju flesh during this time, it's very possible that the parasitic kaiju flesh was the reason why the worm kaiju was born. And it took the emotions of the collective army after being slain by Mei and concentrated that emotion to form a new body, which ended up being the worm kaiju, which is also why it has that parasitic ability to infect a host and then grant them kaiju abilities. And because the origins of the worm kaiju are human, that may be why the human who receives its powers is able to retain their personality and consciousness, at least until the worm kaiju gets strong enough and takes over, like when Kafka went berserk mode for the first time while being tested. And also within the chapter, when talking about the parasitic kaiju weapons, they also say that there is an extreme risk that comes with using these that maybe shorten the people's lives, but it hasn't been fully explained yet. But I really would like to know more about these kind of like raw kaiju weapons that they used and how they were kind of crafted and made, as well as the side effects and if it actually led to the transformation of humans into kaiju and how that was dealt with if it did happen. But I know this is probably a shorter video, but I want to thank you for watching if you made it to the end. And if you want more anime videos like this, hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you can be notified anytime I post a new video. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.